Welcome to all PCU members. In our last two lessons, I was telling you about the weaknesses of the f7 square and sacrifices on h7. Well, I think it's just not fair to skip g7. Of course, f7, g7, and h7 are typically the three pawns that are guarding a king after castling. Of course, it could be also on the white side. When white castles, those would be the f2, g2, h2. So that's just kind of the same thing. So let's look at some situations when the weak point is the g7 pawn. In fact, when a king has castled, the worst pawn to lose is the middle one. That makes the king's castled position the weakest. As long as one is able to keep f7 and g7, or g7 and h7, the situation may not be all that bad. But when a pawn would be missing in the middle on g7, that's usually a very bad sign. Now, at times, you may be able to simply go after the pawn and attack it. But most of the time, a simple attack, for example like here, if the white queen would move to g5 to double up on the g file and attack the g7 pawn a second time trying to checkmate, black could simply play f6, attack the queen, and open up the 7th rank to defend the pawn. And that would give black enough time to defend against white's attack. And if you look carefully, you will notice that black already has a rather significant material advantage, having an exchange up and 2 more pawns as well. So at this moment, white needs to look for a very forceful way to accomplish its goal. And its goal is to develop a winning attack. And as I mentioned in this lesson, we'll be talking about sacrifices on that key g7 square. The sacrifice may come from a rook, from a knight, from a bishop, some cases even a queen. Unlike in the previous lesson when we discussed the bishop sacrifices on h7. That particular pattern is very specific to a bishop sacrifice followed usually by a knight check and a queen attack. Here it's more generic and there isn't immediate straight typical pattern, except of course a queen is rather crucial, and a queen g5 check following a sacrifice on g7 would be great, but it's certainly not the only way to follow up a sacrifice on g2 or g7. Let's see the answer to this position. Of course, you have a big hint when you know we're talking about sacrifices on g7. But even if you know that that's the solution, or at least that's the first move, you still need to find the follow-up. Because the last thing you want to do is to give up on an important piece, such as a rook, not knowing how you will follow up. In fact, I strongly suggest that any time you sacrifice significant material like a knight, bishop, rook, or even a queen, you'd want to make sure you want to double check and triple check that the sacrifice works. Because as I like to say, the pieces don't grow back, they don't grow on the trees. Once you give up on a piece, that piece typically does not come back until the next game. Okay, so try to figure out after rook takes g7 in this position and the black king recaptures on g7, what's the follow-up? Typically, it's a forceful move. So here, rook captures g7 check. Now, if black does not capture the rook but moves the king to the corner, then white would simply move the queen to h6. On one hand, protecting the rook, and on the other hand, creating an immediate unstoppable checkmate threat by capturing the pawn on h7. So let's go back and see what happens if black indeed accepts the sacrifice. Now black's material advantage seems devastating. Black is up a rook, an exchange, and a pawn. That's a lot of material. Of course, white needs to follow up with a check on g5, forcing the black king to the corner. Now in this position, white can be content because white already has a guaranteed draw. White would have the option just move back and forth with the queen, checking the king, giving the king only one option, moving out of the check, and settle for a draw by perpetual checks. However, when you see a good option, always look around and see if you have a better one. And indeed, in this case, white can win. White does not need to settle for a draw. And that key move is to bring another piece to the attack, bringing the knight to f5, which threatens with a typical checkmate of queen g7. And in addition, white is also threatening to play knight h6. So both are checkmates, and while black may defend against one, certainly not against both at the same time. And now let's move on to our next example, where black uses the sacrifice on g2 not to achieve an immediate checkmate, like we saw in our first example, but to simply win material. And in this case, black can again do the sacrifice and do a check on g4, and then when the white king is forced to move to the corner, simply queen takes knight and black won a pawn. Now, in addition to winning a pawn, it's almost equally important the fact that white no longer has the pawn on g2 guarding the king. And therefore, black's plan will be in the near future to bring the rook out here and develop a mating attack. Let's see a couple of beautiful combinations on the theme on sacrifices on g2. Here we go. This game has been played in a game in 1977 back in Hungary. And at the moment, if you look carefully, you'll notice that white is a pawn ahead, and it clearly seems that the black king is the one in a much bigger danger than the white king, as the white king has two of its pawns in front of it on g2 and h2, while black does not have a g or h pawn anymore. However, what of course counts for black's favor is that the black pieces are a lot more active, and the rooks are on open files, the queen is eyeing right at the white king, and it's black's turn, which is very, very important whose turn it is in this case. Black in this position, again, can play very forcefully and sacrifice the rook immediately. When the king captures back, the black rook is ready to come down to c2, and now black is winning because after king g1, the checkmate arrives right away. Let's see now a really, really old game that was played in 1885 by one of the greats of that time, Chigorin, against Arnold. In this position, it's black's turn, and as we can see, the black knight has been targeted by the white pawn, and at the moment, white has quite significant material advantage as white has both his rooks while black doesn't have any. Amazingly, in this position, black has a forced checkmate in just 3 moves. And this is a real elegant representation of harmony between pieces. In this case, black is ready to sacrifice even their own queen. Can you believe that? Sacrifice the whole entire queen in order to get rid of the key defending pawn in front of the white king. After queen takes g2, king has to take back, and now black can force the checkmate in just 2 more moves. Of course, I gave it away by saying force, which means black must give a check. And now, whether the king goes to f1, allowing checkmate with knight h2, or the king moves up to g3 and allowing checkmate from f2, the game is over for white. What an elegant and beautiful combination. Well, one message I can already give you from all of these examples that we saw, and namely, if it's about your king, try to make sure your pawn on g2 is safe, because it's a very important and key pawn. Let's see another simple example from a real game also, played right around the turn of the 19th through 20th century. In this position, it seems like that black is doing very well because the white queen is under attack on f5, and so is the white rook on e1. Presumably, black has just played knight e6 to d4, creating a discovery, and if the white queen moves away, the black rook will capture the white rook on e1 with a check. However, white can force a checkmate in just a few moves. And this is a bit different than the previous examples that we saw, or at least like the first couple of examples that we saw, when after the sacrifice on g7, the follow-up was queen g5 or g4 check. Here, white needs to do a bit more, needs to be a bit more creative. Can you think of what it is? Because queen g5, while it would guarantee a draw by perpetual checks, as we actually have seen in the first example that we had, it would not give more because it's too slow to move the bishop up here to threaten checkmate, because black would get the time to capture the rook and then retreat the knight and guard against the checkmate. Let's go back again and look at the position even just after the sacrifice. And imagine white is ready for yet another sacrifice. And that move is moving the bishop to h6. How amazing is that? Well, before we go further of what happens when the king captures the bishop, let's see what happens if it doesn't. If the king moves back to g8, simple, we just give a check on the g file, following it up with a checkmate. Or, if the king moves to h8, the check comes with queen f6, and again, black has no time to defend against the upcoming checkmate with queen g7. But indeed, what happens after king takes bishop? Well, now again, white has a very elegant checkmate in just 2 moves. The king needs to be chased further out, where it has even less defenders around it. And now, the little pawn becomes the hero by giving the checkmate. A very beautiful combination. And now let's see a bit more complex position. Here we are. This is a game in one of the super tournaments played in Tilburg in 1988 between the Dutch super grandmaster Jan Timman and the number one German player of that time, Robert Hübner. The position looks pretty solid and normal, with even material, and if things continue that way, with a likely outcome of a draw. One of the most natural moves here would be to try to play Queen G5 right away, threatening checkmate or the weakening of the dark squares around Black's king. But that would allow Black to simply trade the yet undeveloped bishop for the dangerous-looking knight, and then win a pawn, and Black would be certainly in a very good shape. Another idea that White may have is to trade on d5 with the idea that Black cannot recapture because of the fork on e7. And yet, that would not bring White the desired result either, because after pawn takes pawn, Black can first again trade on f5 and only then recapture, leaving Black without any troubles. So what is the correct sequence here then for White? Well, you know our theme for the lesson, so obviously you need to look at the sacrifice on g7. But White only has a queen around there, and the queen by itself can rarely win. We can definitely confirm that White can immediately guarantee a draw, because after knight takes on g7 and the king captures back and the check comes and king g8, White could simply make a draw by repeating moves the usual way. And in fact, in the actual game, White did give a number of those checks, but then at the end of the day realized that they can do better, and namely bring the rook to the attack. Rook retreats to b3, threatening with checkmate along the g file. Now, if the Black bishop would intend to come to g4, that would at least lose the bishop quickly, either by a queen check on g5 or even playing rook g3, pinning the bishop. In the actual game, after rook b3, Black chose to clear a little escape square for the king on f8. However, even on f8, the king will not quite find peace. After king f8, White can continue by playing rook g7. And now the checkmate threat is obvious, and Black does not have a real satisfactory defense. After bishop e6, for example, White would simply capture the pawn on h7 and then checkmate in the corner. If instead in this position the queen would come back to e7, defending the f7 square and offer an exchange of queens, White would play queen h6, creating a super dangerous discovery. Now, for example, after queen e5, White could simply make a discovered check and win the Black queen. In this position, after rook g7, in the actual game, Black continued by playing rook e7. And in this moment, according to our silicon friends, the simplest win for White would be just to capture that pawn on h7, renew a threat of checkmate on h8, and then after the king starts running, then play rook d1. And it's not hard to get convinced that Black will lose further material and eventually the game. In the actual game, White, instead of capturing the pawn on h7, White played e6. It doesn't ruin anything, but it wasn't really necessary either. The idea was, now that after bishop takes pawn and rook h7 comes, that the rook on a8 will be hanging. So after king e8 and check, White would simply win back the sacrificed material and more, and win that way. A very nice example by the Dutch grandmaster Jan Timman. Let's see one more last example on our theme, sacrifices on g7. As I mentioned, typically the whole purpose on sacrificing on g7 is to destroy the key defender of an opponent's king. And here again, that's what White is accomplishing, giving up the bishop, but totally destroying the defense in front of the opponent's king. A very cute tactic. If Black would protect the knight now, Black would suffer because the rook on c8 is on an unprotected square. And that would allow White to make another sacrifice, and that would be followed up with a fork, winning the Black rook on the following move and leaving White with 2 extra pawns for the queen endgame. Let's go back. Black in the game did not play queen d4 in this position, but played knight f5 fork. And here White has several ways to win. The actual game continued by queen g6. However, the best way to continue here is to play queen h7 check, and after king f8, believe it or not, simply go pawn grabbing. Capture the pawn on b7, and then threaten with queen h8, and Black's position is completely hopeless. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. In this endgame, which was composed by Janov in 1962, by the way, it's only the end of the puzzle, White seems to be in trouble. It seems that between the 2 bishops and the White king being on the same file as the Black rook, they will be losing material, which is true. However, losing material and losing the game is not the same in this case. Try to sit back, think, and figure out how can White not only save the game, but even win the game. Well, that amazing solution is leaving the light squared bishop hanging. Black captures it with a check. And now, if the Black rook moves just to some random square, White checks from b4, and then the White pawn simply advances with a check and then promotes. But what happens if Black is a little bit more resourceful? For example, moving the rook to h8 with the idea that after bishop b4, when the day comes and the pawn promotes, the rook will capture the new queen. Okay, White will capture the rook, but nevertheless the game would still end in a draw if Black would succeed to give up his rook for the pawn. Now, sadly for Black, if king g8, White would have a beautiful pawn checkmate. And if the king goes to e8, then White will play king g7 first before advancing the pawn, and only when the rook leaves the 8th rank, then already the f-pawn will advance successfully. And finally, let's see what happens if after king g6, the rook moves to b5, not allowing the White bishop to go to b4. Now, quite amazingly, White has time to make a quiet move of bishop d2. and then the check will arrive from the other side, from h6. And black faces the same problems, that the f-pawn is unstoppable. Well, thank you for listening. I hope you gained some ideas on how to destroy the defense against the opponent's castled position. Remember, the g-pawn is the most important defender of a king after castling to the king side. Until next week, take care, keep practicing, and I'll be back with some more knowledge to share with you. Bye-bye.